Hello, everybody. Welcome to our office hours. I'm super excited to meet you all in a few weeks for the conference. So this is going to be a chance for us to start a little bit of preparation for the committee we're going to be in, especially since it's going to be a crisis specialized type of committee. So first, I can just tell you a little bit about myself before we get started. So my name is Calvin Osborne. I'm going to be the director for this committee. I'm super excited to be coming to Dubai. I've never been before. And so I'm so excited to go and see the city and meet all of you in our committee. Here on campus, I'm a senior at Harvard College. I am currently pursuing a double concentration in mathematics and philosophy. So I don't study IR, but I'm very, very involved in the Mod UN community here at Harvard. I'm the current Secretary General of HMUN Boston, so our primary conference for high school students down in the city of Boston. And then I also am a competitor on Harvard ICMUN, which is our competitive collegiate Mod United Nations team. Uh, so that's a little bit about me. I'll just speak very briefly generally about the style of the committee, what the committee is going to be about, and then I'm going to want to open up most of this time, if not all of it, to questions from you guys. I think, especially with a committee like this, which has this non-traditional structure, I think it's going to be the most important for you guys to ask any questions that you have for me about how the style of this committee is going to go, well, what its structure is, so you guys can do all of your preparation work and feel confident and comfortable when we walk into that committee room. Okay, with that being said, I'm just going to very quickly go over what the structure of a crisis committee looks like. So this is the crisis committee at HMUN Dubai, and they vary in a lot of ways. They're different from a normal directive resolution based committee, um, but in a lot of ways, I think it also is very similar. So I want to sort of highlight the ways in which these two kinds of committees are in some ways different, in some ways very similar. So first off, instead of writing resolutions in this committee, you'll be writing directives. So what does that mean? Resolutions, as I hopefully a lot of you know, if you have experience in a standard resolution-based committee, are these really long, comprehensive documents that you're working to write throughout the weekend of your committee. So these come in the form of working papers and then draft resolutions. So hopefully, as you know, in a standard resolution-based committee, you spend the first session setting the agenda, you spend the next few sessions writing working papers, you spend the last few sessions writing draft resolutions. That is not the structure of what you're going to produce in a crisis committee like ours for this weekend. Instead, we are writing directives, which are one, much smaller than resolutions. Instead of being maybe 15, 20, 25, 30 page documents. These are going to be one handwritten into only the span of a few pages. So directives are going to be maybe 2 to 4 page documents that you're going to be handwriting with your peers during the committee session. Instead of taking a few committee sessions to write, like a draft resolution or a working paper, these directives are probably going to take about 30, 45 minutes to write. So it's a much, 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 much more compressed format. And with that comes a lot more leniency with what it looks like. In comparison to a resolution-based committee where we're like very strict, or we want you to be very as strict as you can about the formatting of the resolution, making sure that all of the punctuation is correct, making sure that all of the formatting is right, and things are underlined as they should be, and they starting with action verbs. In a directive-based committee, there's a lot more leniency with what those directives look like. So often they're just going to go right into operative clauses. We don't do preambulatory clauses and directives. It's not as strict about only needing one subpoint or starting with verbs or having things underlined. Really, these are going for speed. They're going for efficiency. Because it's the nature of a crisis committee, we're going to be covering a lot of content and going through a lot of very specific crises throughout the weekend. So as our weekend develops, crises will be coming up relating to the topic at hand, and your task will be over the next 30, 45 minutes to work with each other to write these directives that solve all of the problems that you are being presented by our staffers. So that's one of the most important ways that a directive-based committee is going to differ from a resolution-based committee. But the second important point, this is what really sets a crisis committee apart from other committees, is this backroom component. So running over very quickly what backroom looks like. So what do I mean first by backroom? We like to differentiate when we're talking about crisis committees between your front room and your back room. So front room is going to be what would happen most of the time in any other committee, any other resolution-based committee. So this is the time that you're spending working on writing speeches, speaking during modern caucuses, writing your modern caucuses directives, working in unmods with other people to write directives, merging these papers together, presenting them, voting, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is all your front room. So the standard resolution, Mod UN based activity. The second part of a crisis committee is this backroom component. And that's really where the word crisis comes in hand. So what this is going to look like is throughout the weekend, you're going to be writing a series of letters to people in your life that you want to have do something on your behalf. So for example, let's do a different hypothetical committee as to not go into the specifics of this committee topic yet. But for example, let's say you were in a committee on the Mumbai Mafia. This was a committee that I did a few years ago at a Georgetown's conference. So let's say that you are a representative of the Mafia of Mumbai in the 1900s, and talking about you're talking about the mafia, and you're talking about illicit activity, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe the first letter you write could be to a friend of yours who is in a different sect of the group. And you can say, hello, dear my friend, blah, blah, blah. And then you write this letter asking them for a few specific requests. So how I like to structure my notes, these are something that really can look different from person to person. But this is the way that works for me, and this is the way that I'm suggest that my delegates write their notes, especially to make sure that they're going to be as streamlined and easy for us to go through as possible. So what a crisis note looks like is first you're gonna introduce yourself to them. You're gonna say, Dear Bethany, my friend from college who's an expert in poisons. And then you'll give a little cute intro, keep it brief, but you can say something funny maybe. Hi, Bethany. Been so long since I've seen you, blah, blah, blah. Then you're going to go into a list of bullet points where you're going to do your specific requests throughout in this note. So maybe one, can you reach out to this person on behalf and ask for this thing? Two, I want to use this thing to build up train a bunch of soldiers. Three, I want you to put all those soldiers in blah, blah, blah. So you're going to go through a few bullet pointed requests, and then at the end of your note, make a little goodbye, and then best your name. And then the last thing you're going to do is write a TLDR. So this is a too long, didn't read. But this is really, we will read your notes. But this is so when we're quickly going through those notes afterwards or in reference for a crisis break, we can get a very brief, like one sentence description of what you asked for in this note. So just super compressed, like TLDR, train troops, bring them here. The army is called this. Um, so throughout the weekend, you're going to be writing these notes. We'll do something called a two-pad system. So you'll get two notepads at the start of the committee. You'll write your first note on pad one, and then after however much time, probably about 20, 25 minutes, members of our backroom staff, so our assistant directors, will come and collect those notes and then bring them to our backroom to read through and write you a little response, letting you know if it was successful, if it was not. Um, so you're gonna have two notepads at the start of the committee. After about 20 minutes, your first one will be collected, and then you can start writing your second notepad to your second individual. So maybe this time you're writing to your husband, who is blah blah blah, or you're writing to your wife, who is blah blah blah. So you're gonna have these two notepads. First one will be collected, then you can write your second notepad. Then again, after about 30, 25, 35 minutes, our backroom staff will come back in. They will hand you your first notepad, which will have a written response on it, and then they will collect your second notepad. And then throughout the weekend, we'll be doing about 30, 35-minute inter cycles where you'll write a note in the notepad you have. It'll be collected by our backroom staff. It'll be swapped out, and you will write on the new notepad. So you always have something to write on for the backroom. So now, the next important question is, why is this important? Why do we do this? And the reason why is because this gives you a chance to really directly influence the debate that's happening in committee. So let's say in your backroom notes that you're starting an army and maybe you're going to move that army towards some country and it makes some big impact. We're going to read through your notes. We're going to evaluate your notes on a number of things. Do we think they're well written? Do we think it provides an adequate amount of detail? Is this like a well thought out plan? Have you given us enough steps to make sure that we can do this feasibly? Is this something that we could imagine a universe in which your character could feasibly do this? We do get to take a lot of liberties because obviously we don't have time to go through full levels of detail. But have you put in a convincing amount of groundwork so that we're going to feel okay giving you this thing? And then are you asking for a reasonable amount in the time frame of a note? So we're going to evaluate these notes. If you think something is successful and it goes through, write your response letting you know that you were successful and you've built your army or you've started a cult or you've blah, blah, blah. And then every about 45 minutes, I'd say, or so after we finish a round of directives, our backroom staff will come back in for a crisis break, which will be a little skit where they'll act out the events that have occurred between the last directive round. So they'll let you know, one, was your directive successful? Maybe as part of the crisis break, the last crisis break, there was a dam that broke. So you have a directive all about fixing the dam. It passes, it provides a lot of detail. Our backroom staff will come in and let you know that the dam has been rebuilt, it's successful, the people are happy. Now we have all of access to good drinking water. In contrast, maybe the note wasn't very well fleshed out. The directive didn't have a lot of detail. The directive didn't consider some important factor. The backroom staff will come in and say, no, this was unsuccessful for X, Y, and Z reasons. We still have this dam issue, and maybe it's gotten worse since we were unable to fix it in this time. So the really fun dynamic nature of a crisis committee is exactly that. It's going to allow us to really, one, have the crises that happen be influenced by you. It's going to be driven, especially after the first break, by the things that you put into your notes, what you want to see us discuss, what are sort of the actions that your character wants to take. So one, you get to influence the debate in that way. And then two, you get to influence debate by writing these directives. So how high quality they are, what topics you want to discuss, what actions you take are then going to directly influence how the course of committee goes. So it's this fun semi-role playing, really into like debate on issues about country politics, issues about military, issues about the economy, um, part both of these worlds, which is why I think they're so fun. Last thing I will say about Backroom before I open up the floor to questions, is that in these notes, ultimately you want to be pushing towards a primary goal for your character. So you want to think about the character you're given. You have a description of who they are, what are their resources, what are their possible goals and motivations. And something important that you should consider before you come into the committee is going to be what is my end goal as this character? So let's say that I am currently the Secretary of Agriculture for the US government. Maybe I'm in some committee, maybe Nixon's cabinet. And my goal is to become the president. So I'm going to let my backroom staff know that this is my goal. I'll write at the top, end goal, colon, write out my end goal. If it changes, which is totally okay, your end goal is going to change all the time. I'll write like new end goal, and then I'll describe what's changed, or maybe if it's something entirely new. So one, you should think about what your end goal is going to be. And then two, think about, is this a reasonable thing you can do in notes that you're sending about every 30, 35, 45 minutes? So think about, is this a reasonable goal for you to achieve? Do you have a well thought out plan of how to get there? And three, is this end goal something that ultimately is good for my character? So this is, I think, the final thing that differentiates a crisis committee from any other type of committee, is you have an opportunity to be pretty selfish in your crisis notes. So while in our front room debates, delegates will always be asked to be cordial and they'll be asked to think about the way that committee is going to be moved forward as the best for all. In this back room, you really are writing these notes for the end goal of pushing your own personal agenda. So think about what maybe unique end goal could this character want? Do they want to attract a bunch of followers and start a new country? Do they want to raise a huge military and take over some place? Do they want to sneak their way into a government position? Do they want to blah, 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 blah? But think about all the different things, personal things that your character wants. So this might not be directly related to the topic of the committee at hand, but in some way is going to engage with the content of what we're discussing. So I think a well thought out crisis arc, what we like to call them. So like the end goal and then all the steps you're going to take to get there. Will have a reasonable but big end goal, something satisfying to achieve, makes sense for your character. Something that two put very strongly pushes your personal agenda. So maybe your character has some well justified reason why they would want this goal, or you could explain it if your crisis staff are asked. And then three, thinking about is it reasonable the amount of steps that you need to take to get there. So given what my character has, is this something that I could feasibly do in committee? And maybe the last step would be, is this having a really big impact on the debate at hand? So ultimately, there's going to be a number of delegates in our committee, I think anywhere from 20 to 30. So we're not going to be able to incorporate every single detail of your notes into these breaks. What we're going to do is going to pick the stuff that is, one, the best organized, the best written, has the most justification, but two, also has the most direct impact on what committee is doing at that moment. And so just because you write the perfect note, maybe it doesn't fit into exactly what we're planning for this next break. But we'll definitely incorporate all of this well-written, well-justified information into an eventual crisis break. But something that's really important for you to do is think about how impactful will this be on the committee at large. So maybe your end goal does make a lot of sense for your character, and maybe it's something pretty big, but maybe it's something that really doesn't have an impact on the debate that we're having. So if I was in this committee and my dream was to become a Hollywood star, that would be great. And maybe my character loves the movies and you found that information online through research, and that's awesome. But you're not really going to be having a huge impact on the Indian independence movement through your pursuits in becoming an American Hollywood actor. So think about an end goal that's reasonable for your character, makes sense with what your vision is and what their personal motivations are, uh, is something that you could feasibly accomplish in the span of this committee time. And then three is something that's going to have a huge impact on the specific debate at hand. So ultimately, somehow, it should be something relevant to this committee, relevant to the people in it. It's something that's really going to force delegates to really consider it in their notes. So something of such importance that they have to discuss it, or else it would be a serious detriment to the committee at large. So that's what all I will say for now about crisis committees. Again, it has a lot of very unique components to other committees, but essentially it is still just a very compressed timeline of a standard committee. So we're writing directives instead of resolutions, but they're just smaller, handwritten, the exact same documents. We're going to do the same moderated, unmoderated debates. We're going to do the same introducing. We're going to vote on things. Instead of doing a presentation or Q&A authors panel, we do for and against speeches, just because we're writing so many directives. It's possible this could change at some point, given a special occasion, but by and large, we'll do two for, two against speakers for all of our directives. But again, it's just the same structure as a committee, just taking the timeline of a few committee sessions, compressing that down to a half hour, 45 minutes, and doing it over and over and over again on the course of the weekend. So again, it's very fun, very dynamic, super fast paced, and very delegate driven. Okay, with that being said, I can open up the floor to questions. I really want to make sure that if you guys have any specific confusions about how this committee is going to run, any confusion about how a crisis committee looks, whether this is something that is considered feasible for your character, I'm happy to discuss that now. So if people have questions, feel free to throw them into the chat. Or there is a raise hand feature. I am not a Zoom expert, but I'm pretty sure I can figure out how to unmute you for the question. Okay, do we have any questions? Oh, I'm. Oh, perfect. Okay, so I'm seeing some questions in the chat. My apologies, I wasn't looking at the right feature. But our first question I see is there are not working papers in crisis committees, right? Yes, great question. So we don't do working papers. We're going to just do what the equivalent of draft resolutions would be. So given any extenuating circumstances, you're just going to write one document. If it passes, it passes. If it fails, we're going to move on. We're going to just discard it, and we're going to move on to future work. But we're not going to do a working paper. We're going to debate it, we're going to present it, then we're going to revise it, and then do draft resolutions. Just one round, just one document, but it's going to be compiled from a bunch of different people's work. So at the beginning of the committee, depending on the specific number of people that are actually there, and then also just the circumstances of how the dynamics of the room, I will set a minimum number of sponsors you need. So the sponsors again are going to be the people who actually wrote the document, a minimum number, and this is going to be something to encourage collaboration among delegates. I don't want one delegate to write a 5-page document on their own and then not collaborate with the work of other people. So one, uh, one, there's going to be a minimum sponsors count, also similarly minimum signatories count, but then a maximum page count. So I'll give you a page range. It's likely going to be maybe 2 to 4 or 2 to 5 or 1 to 4. But this is going to be a maximum number of pages and a minimum number of pages. Maximum so that reasonably we can get through it in efficient time, especially given the dynamic nature of this committee. But then a minimum number of pages, again, to encourage collaboration. So what it's going to look like, most likely, is going to be delegates who are going to be writing maybe one-page documents on their own, maybe a half-page document, and working with their neighbor on the other half, whatever format you want to do. But then during this unmoderated debate, people are going to go around and merge these documents together. If you have a stapler, feel free to bring it so we can staple these documents. If not, we can just sort of kitty corner fold over the corner. But so you're going to take maybe 4 pages of writing that all these people have worked together on, compile it together into one document, go through and edit it, make sure it's good on concise, there's no contradictions, then turn it into the dais. So great question about how those papers are going to look like. I'm just going to move down chronologically. We'll have time to get through all of these questions, so don't worry. It takes a second to get to yours. The next question I see is, can delegates be committed for treason and trial be conducted in committee? Great question. This is also something that I think is one of the most fun parts of a crisis committee, is that we get to do a lot of non-traditional things based off of what you want to do as committee. So really, the world is your oyster. As long as it's well justified, as long as we think it's interesting, as long as we think it's going to steer debate in a positive direction, and be fun and engaging for our delegates, we really, really, really are willing to break parliamentary procedure, to break standard practices, and do something more innovative, more non-traditional. So these can look like things that happen very often are trials, like was asked in the Q&A. So maybe you have been found out for committing this thing. Maybe in our directive, we said we're going to send our investigators to look into who did this, and we're going to do X, Y, and Z and pay them with this money and blah, blah, blah. Then maybe backroom will come in and let you know who did it. And if you want to hold them on a trial or blah, blah, blah. But I've seen all sorts of other non-traditional things done in committee. So really, we get a lot of chances in a crisis committee to have innovative, non-traditional debates. Maybe we will do some Q&A in there. Maybe we'll stick to just working papers. Maybe committee's going to be split in half for a bit. Maybe they'll stay together the whole time. Maybe we'll do trials. Maybe we won't. We really get the chance to, one, have committee be steered by your direction and the things that you want to do. So we can't make any promises now on what will happen because it's all up to what you guys want to do as delegates and as individuals. Uh, so one, it's going to be this delegate-driven nature to these like non-traditional components. But two, we get a lot of flexibility in exploring all the different avenues that you want to do in debate. So if you want to push the committee toward doing something non-traditional, talk about that in your crisis notes. If we see an opportunity to break up the ice, do something sort of fun and innovative, we'll almost always take that opportunity. So really, we have a lot of chances in this committee to do this non-traditional debate, given the fact that we're doing these directives every 30, 45 minutes. So it's not going to take all weekend to write one document. So another great question. I'm going to move on to the next question that I see, which is so in the front room, are we going to write directives with clauses? In the back room, we're going to write letters. Yes, that's exactly it. Great summary. So in this front room, that's where you're writing these directives, handwritten with clauses, no preamps, but in every other way, very similar to a normal draft resolution. And then the back room, you're writing these personal secret letters. So that's sort of the breakup between what you're going to be writing over the weekend. Note though that you will be writing them at the same time. So it's going to be very hectic. It's going to be very crazy. And that's sort of the atmosphere that we're trying to foster in a crisis committee. Emphasis on the crisis. So you're going to have to be really efficient about how you're spending your time writing directives, how you're spending time collaborating with people, how you're spending your time writing these backroom notes. So a lot of things to juggle, and that is sort of the challenge, unique challenge of a crisis committee. I see another question though about can we write letters with another person, like joint directives in the back room? A great question. This is sort of an advanced technique, I could like to say. But yes, this is definitely that I'm pretty sure we'll be able to do in committee. So these are something called JPDs or joint personal directives. But basically, this is you collaborating with another delegate in that backroom component. So while normally you're just writing notes as yourself, as your character, to some individual, pushing some agenda, maybe you figure out that some other character has some resource that really could help you. So maybe this person has been gathering these people and I really want access to these people, or they got a bunch of this resource that I really want access to. You could write a joint note together, maybe exchanging resources, maybe combining your resources to do something. Really, it's just going to be sort of a continuation of your crisis note, but collaborated with another person. And then, so you'll both sign the notes, sign and confirm that you both are okay with what's said in the notes, turn that in alongside your backroom, and this is someone added component to that backroom component. So you can work together with other delegates, compile your resources to do something big. Maybe half of the committee is going to write a JPD together to do something huge. I'm going to say most likely we're going to be able to do them. It's definitely not a priority for me as a backroom staffer. I think if it's, I'm really going to focus in on what's written in your individual notes, and if there's enough content there, we probably won't get a lot of detail in the JPDs. But I will incorporate all of that into sort of the universe, the world building that we do. Um, just two more things I'll say in JPDs. One, if you're doing them, I encourage you to be as substantive as possible with them. I think this is something I see a lot in the college circuit, is people sort of just writing JPDs to write JPDs. So they're sort of submitting them to feel like they've done it and indicate that they're able to do it and impress the backroom staff. I really want to encourage you not to do that and to use them only when you actually have some genuine resource that you two can combine, some like logical, ideally very impactful end goal that you can do together. Those I think are the most successful JPDs. Then two, keep in mind that a delegate can backstab you in a JPD. Um, Maybe I've gotten access to this resource and I'm giving you this, but then in my own note, I'm writing, actually, I'm going to sabotage the things I give them, or maybe I'm going to now use this resource in this way that they didn't expect. So always be cautious of what people want to do in a JPD. That being said, I see a few more questions in the chat for now. I have a question that says, can we ask in our crisis notes to be connected to another delegate for support in a crisis arc? Great question. I think that was maybe answered a little bit by the last question about writing joint these JPDs. That's one way that you can collaborate with another delegate. You definitely can, in other ways, interact with each other. Maybe you want to investigate another delegate because you think they may have nefarious goals, or maybe they're sabotaging you. Maybe you figured out that some delegate has access to this resource and you want to sabotage that and specifically mention that you know it's this person's and you know where they live, so blah, blah, blah. These are all possibilities, all ways that you can interact with other delegates in your crisis notes. But just one thing I'll say in that is keep in mind that ultimately the most successful crisis arcs are going to get you brought up a lot in debates, going to center things around the issues that are most important to you. So just keep that in mind. That is a balancing act of the amount that you should work with other delegates and then the amount that you should keep your arc unique to you. So do whatever you think feels right. And then during the committee, if you have questions, want to know if you think we agree with what you're thinking, let us know, and our backroom staff would be happy to answer. Love to see all these questions. The next one I see is the end goal for the committee as a cabinet, uh, is the end goal mentioned for the committee as a cabinet a compulsory goal to be accomplished? Oh, great question. So really, it is up to you guys what we want, what this committee is going to look like past that first session at the longest. So the beginning of the committee is going to be crisis are crisis breaks that are driven by that back room. So these are going to be, especially the committee's just started. We don't have any notes from you. So we have come up with and are when finalizing what that first crisis break is going to look like. So, but these are going to be things that are drawn directly from the background guide, points that are brought up in there, sort of short-term goals that are being mentioned in the background guide in that current situation, summary of the problem section, so that's like the most current pressing matters at this moment. But really, after that first crisis break, and as much as possible throughout the weekend, we want these breaks to be driven by the things that you're doing in your notes. So if you're building this group, we're going to mention them in the crisis breaks. If you're attacking this nation, we're going to mention them in the crisis breaks. If you do this big thing, we'll mention the crisis breaks. Well, especially the beginning of the committee is going to be driven a bit more by the background guide. As soon as possible, we want to get things off going with delegate-driven arcs. And that means we really can't predict what the end goal of this committee is going to be. Maybe the India has achieved its independence, maybe it does not. Maybe we have freed ourselves from colonial rule, maybe we have not. Maybe some other crazy consequences happened. Maybe India is split apart. Maybe we've been taken over. Maybe blah, blah, blah. Really, I cannot predict at this moment where committee is going to go because it's all going to be driven by the actions that you take as individuals. And I think is another cool part of a crisis committee. Okay, but the next question that I see is, can we write information directives like asking for the numbers of troops and doctors in case of attack? Yes, you can definitely ask for any details that you want in these notes. One thing just to keep in mind, and this hopefully is obvious, but there are some things that we do not want you to be discussing or utilizing in your crisis notes. Even though this is a semi-historical committee, this is the mid 1900s. We are going to be walking into this committee with a 2025, crazy, a 2025 mindset. So we ask that you be sensitive to topics that, even if they weren't sensitive at the time, are now. And then obviously there are some things that we ask you never commit in your notes, things like genocide, things like child labor, et cetera, et cetera. But things like going to war and killing people. Those are usually fine in the context of this committee. Really, it's going to be things that would obviously classify as just horrible, horrible atrocities. But beyond that, you really can, the world is your oyster. Maybe you want to reach out for individual resources. Maybe you want to reach out for people. Maybe you want to reach out to specific individuals for the knowledge that they have or the specific resource that they have. You can do almost anything you want to do in your notes. And as long as it's well justified, we'll be okay with that in the back room. But yes, you can definitely ask for things like specific number of troops. You can ask for to try to reach out to people maybe to join your organization. If you're starting a new religion, to become followers, whatever you want to do. Uh, just be specific and then be well justified in your notes. And let us know as early as possible what your end goal is, so we can help you get there or let you know if we don't think that's going to be feasible to achieve in the weekend. The next question I see is, can I sabotage directives in my back room even if it is proposed by me? Will it affect my standing in committee? Great question. So I think I'm going to be really involved in both the front and back room, as well as all of my staffers. And so we're going to know, so we have a pretty good idea of what's going on. So this is something you definitely should do and are encouraged to do, or if you want to sort of have should say some things in the front room and then contradict them in the back room. That is 100% something you're able to do in committee, and I think it's something very accurate to the real world. In front of committee, you're saying one thing, you're showing one side of you, and then when it comes to your secret agenda, you're doing something else. So definitely something you can do in committee. And if you ever think we're confused about what you're doing, because sometimes we will get confused, these plans you've been thinking of all weekend, we only can glimpse into them through these notes. So it's very possible we get confused about what you're asking for. So just let us know. We have lots of time for feedback. Let us know. Give us some ideas. Ask us about, tell us what your end goal is. Let us know if you think it's reasonable. Or we'll let you know if we think it's reasonable. Tell us what your specific plan is to get there. Keep us in the loop as much as possible. And then we'll be sure to understand. But by and large, we really have a good idea of what's going on in that front room, back room divide. And we're going to be very conscious and encourage delegates to really be as crafty as they'd like to be in pursuing their personal agenda. I'm gonna grab a sip of water very quickly. Okay, I see. The next question I see is it more important to be accomplished in front room or back room? A fantastic question. I think it really is a pretty even split between the two. And when it comes to how we're evaluating delegates for things like the sake of awards, we're going to be considering pretty evenly your performance in the front room and the back room. But really, we do take a holistic approach to evaluating delegates, especially in terms of this front room back room divide. So ultimately, it's going to come down to how impactful your front room was, how impactful your back room is. And we're conscious of the fact that it would not be at all possible for delegates to be 100% perfect in both. Really focusing on one, you're going to take trade backs from the other. But definitely don't focus all of your energy into one component and none into the other. If you have the best backroom but are not actively contributing to directives, that is not going to be a good thing that we're going to see. And then same as vice versa. Maybe you're always on directives and you're very substantive and impactful, but you're not writing crisis notes, or the goal isn't very well fleshed out, or you're not putting your best effort there. That also is going to look bad from the dais. So we ask you sort of, you can come use your personal judgment to decide where exactly to make that divide. We ask you to spend a good amount of time on both. But we as a staff know that it isn't feasible for someone to spend 100% effort in both components at the same time. But it is the unique part of this crisis committee is that we're juggling a lot of balls, whereas the resolution-based committees can sometimes go slowly. This is always going to be at a fast pace. The next question I see is there a specific year the committee will end? Same as, hopefully this was answered by two before and probably spurred on by this. But really that's going to depend on the pace that you guys want to go to as delegates. I would say, just like a general principle, that this committee is probably going to run over the span of maybe a decade. Don't quote me on that in case things change, but it's likely going to take about a decade of time. So think on the scale of years, not months, and also not decades. So whatever end goal be should hopefully be something that we can accomplish in a few years, maybe a little bit longer, depending on how committee goes, maybe a little bit shorter. But I would be thinking of this time frame of years, not individual months. We're not going to be going month by month, but we'll be taking maybe 6 month chunks of time at a time. And it's not going to be over the span of decades, so we won't go to the modern day. We'll definitely be staying in this mid-modern history. So the next question I see is if we have doubts on how to accomplish our crisis arc, can we ask in a crisis note? 100%. I think the worst thing you could do as a delegate is feel embarrassed to ask questions or embarrassed to touch base with your crisis staffers to see if they understand what you're doing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If you have something that you think you can phrase well in a crisis note, feel free to write it there. Maybe at the bottom, try like, P.S. This is from me as a delegate. I'm a little confused on X, Y, and Z. You also can feel free to just ask me in unmods, ask me during feedback, ask our backroom staffers during feedback, ask me before debate starts, ask me after debate starts. If it's really urgent, ask me during an unmod, send me a note. I really want to you spend a good portion of time responding to questions, especially given this non-traditional format. We're going to be spending a lot of time answering people's questions, and I don't want anybody to feel any sort of nervousness about asking questions. I am encouraging you to please ask them. And if you have a question about something, it's likely that another delegate does and is just too afraid to step up and ask. So yes, if you have questions, you can write in the crisis notes, talk to your crisis staffer after or before the session, during the session if it's super urgent, during feedback, etc. Okay, that's all the questions I see now. But I'm gonna keep waiting and seeing if any more come into the chat. Oh, uh, I see another question. Are we going to have a workshop at the conference about writing the directives? That is a fantastic question. Um, I don't exactly know the schedule off the top of my head. But let me see, check really fast online, and then see if I can get you an answer to that question. And if not, I will text somebody and see if they can get you an answer to that question. The schedule. Oh, conference. Okay, conference schedule. Okay, so I am seeing MUN 101 rules of procedure happening on the first day. So during this time, it's likely that we'll have some amount of portion of this spent on talking about resolutions, talking about crisis committees. But I'll be honest that I expect a lot of the time to be spent on the resolution-based committees, just based on the fact that they represent the most delegates in the conference. Um, and so that's what I think a lot of the time and the questions are going to be spent on. But we will effectively use our first committee session, or at least the first portion of it, as a training session. We will have ample time to go through questions people have. I'm going to re-go through all this information about how directives are going to look. Probably draw a little picture of what a directive could look like. We'll go through crisis notes. I'll draw a little picture of what a crisis note can look like. We'll have time to field all your questions. So we will definitely do our own training session, even if it's not official. So if you have any questions that come up between now and the conference, do not worry. We will have time to answer them before committee starts. I see another question. Approximately how many directives are expected to be submitted to the DICE throughout the weekend? That is also a great question. Again, sorry to say it again, but it's really going to depend on you guys. But I would say on average, it probably is going to take about 45 minutes to an hour to go through directives. So that means in a 2 hour committee session, we should expect to go through maybe two, 3 rounds of directives. In a 3 hour committee session, maybe three, 4 rounds of directives. And if we have any 4 hour sessions, maybe four or five uh, directives. So I would say maybe the number of hours plus one, somewhere in that ballpark, is the number of directives we'll write every committee session, and then add those up throughout the weekend. So I think that is a great question, something to think about with pacing. But it also is going to depend on how long you guys want to spend doing moderated debates, how long it takes you guys to write these directives. So I'm going to encourage you to go fast when I think we're going too slow, and encourage you to slow down when I think we're not taking enough time thinking about the issues. But really, the specific amount of time we spend is going to depend on how long you want to take doing moderated debates, how quickly you want to go through these directives rounds, et cetera, et cetera. It's more than likely throughout the weekend at some point that we'll do something called a time crisis. So I'll give you a specific timeline then and when I need to see a directive submitted, or else there'll be consequences. So those are fun and very exciting and very hectic. But if unless it's the situation where I've given you a specific timeline, it's really going to be driven by what you guys do as delegates. Okay, again, I don't see any new questions, but I'm just going to hang around for a few minutes and see if any questions begin to pop up. If you also want to use the raise hand feature, feel free to do that as well. Oh, awesome. I see a few more questions have come through in the chat. So let's go through these. I see a question saying, can we write letters in the front room and send them through admins? I don't know exactly what we mean by this. But so for the letters I assume we're talking about these backroom notes. These are going to be written at the same time as front room is going on. So you'll write these notes while debate is happening. This is sort of part of the chaotic nature of the crisis committees. Are going to be doing a lot at once. So for example, you're going to be writing these crisis notes at the same time as you're giving speeches, at the same time as you're going through moderated debate, as you're writing directives. It's a little hectic there. But you'll go through and write these letters at the same time. And then there'll be designated periods where backroom staffers will come into the room. They'll collect these notes. They'll give you your other notes, this sort of note swap, and you'll continue on with debate that way. So you're not going to be sending the notes up to the dais. There's going to be designated collection times. So keep conscious in committee about when that time is. I'll give you frequent updates. But so you can sort of, it's your responsibility to pace yourself during that time on how long you want to spend in the note and then how long you want to spend on the other components of front room debate. The next question I see is, as there are less number of delegates in crisis, can we exceed the timings of round robins? Oh, great questions. So definitely I expected to do a number of round robins throughout the weekends. This question was accurate, and that we have less number of delegates than a standard resolution-based committee. Just given the nature that these are handwritten notes, we're going to be going through a lot of them over the weekend. And again, the crisis committee is all about speed and efficiency. We don't want to be spending forever going through so 10-page resolutions, directives. We don't want people to not have an opportunity to add to directives, and we want to give people a lot of chances to speak over the weekend. So we have less number of delegates. So yes, we're going to be doing a lot of round robins. This is sort of a common suspension of the rules. We're going to literally go around in a circle, and everyone will have a chance to speak. Uh, I'm going to ask us to likely not do speeches longer than a span of a minute, though. Again, just given as this is a fast-paced committee, I want to keep debate going, and I don't want people to feel nervous about giving a speech longer than a minute. So a minute is going to be a hard cap on the length of speeches, but 30-second, 45-second, a minute long speeches are all fine. If we're feeling crazy, maybe a 20-second speech. But all of those are okay for round robins. And again, it's going to be really driven by what you think is going to be appropriate, given the timing, how long you want to spend actually doing moderated debate versus being in unmods and merging together documents and writing them. It's really all up to you. So again, I'll wait around for a few minutes to see if we have any more questions in the chat. If you have any other questions though that come up after this session before the conference, we do have a committee email. I'll be monitoring that as best as I can. Please be patient as it is currently the holidays here. But feel free to ask those in our Gmail, committee Gmail. But also, again, we'll have lots of designated time at the beginning of the weekend to go through all of your individual questions. So if any further confusion comes up about a crisis note, maybe you misunderstood something that you realized during our training sessions, feel free to ask, and we'll have a lot of designated time for us to just talk about how things are going, how comfortable we're feeling with the crisis notes. I'll be touching base with you guys all the time about how comfortable you're feeling about your notes, if you're feeling like they're being successfully incorporated into the breaks, etc., etc., etc. If I think your directives are being well written, if I think it's an adequate number of detail. So we'll have a lot of training time at the beginning of the session throughout the weekend. So don't feel nervous if you have any questions or confusion uh, on that front. If anybody has any more questions, feel free to ask them in the chat. Uh, Happy to answer any more questions people have about the fourth structure committee, how it's going to go, the format, any questions you have about the procedure of a crisis committee. Oh, amazing. I see another question in the chat. How exciting. Somebody asked, can I modify or adjust my character without harming the authenticity? That is a fantastic question. Thank you for asking this. So yes, you are definitely going to be able to take a lot of creative liberties with your character, especially given what is going to be a reasonable amount of research. So for example, maybe we don't actually know much about your character. That's an opportunity for you to really take a lot of creative liberty about who your relationships to people are, who you might know. But even if you are a really well-known character, you definitely can take you can make reasonable changes to your character that you think is going to push your individual den to make it a bit easier to do an arc, etc. So maybe you want to pretend that back in high school you knew X person. Totally fine as long as it's partially reasonable in some way. Um, Really, any reasonable change you want to make to your character can be okay by us. The character descriptions in the background guide are really there to be stepping off points as you do your own research and as you come to your own conclusions about what your character might want. So as you're researching your character, whatever details you find, feel free to incorporate that into your crisis arc. But you do not have to incorporate all of that research if you don't want to. Incorporate it from whatever you want to from the background guide. Make any reasonable changes you want to, and just let us know in your notes if you want to make any more significant changes. These characters are yours to really make who they are, and I would use that background guide as a stepping off point, not as the final say. So really feel free to make any reasonable changes to your characters, but we ask that you keep really the heart of that character and who their maybe what their job is, what their overall opinions might be, what their largest characteristics are. Those are what you want to drive your thinking about this character around, not the small, minute details. Fantastic question in the chat. I'll keep monitoring it if we have any more over the remainder of our time. Amazing. See another question. Somebody's asked in the chat, what if I'm unsure of my end goal? Can I just go with the flow or just proceed with my then current intention? Great question. So really, if you ever are uncertain about your end goal, At this point, this is the time for you to maybe do a little bit of more research into your character, into the timeline of the committee. Thinking about the ways in which your character, things that they currently have, resources they currently have access to, and what are things that they realistically might want to do with these resources. I think ideally your end goal is going to be something that's a little bit more innovative than maybe just like the standard flow of history. That's not to say that we won't be incorporating a lot of historical elements into committee, and you definitely are encouraged to make it realistic to what your character's goals could have been at the time. But I encourage you to try to think maybe a little bit more creatively or innovatively about what are some more interesting goals that your character might want to pursue. But something that is 100% going to happen throughout the weekend is your end goal is going to change. Um, Maybe you're going to lose access to a resource that was really central to your end goal, or you're going to hear from your backroom staff that they don't think it's reasonable for you to push for this goal. Or maybe you could come up with something more interesting throughout the weekend, or debate flows in a direction that you think if you wanted to pivot your arc in this way would be really successful. Um, you are encouraged, it's understood, it's expected that your end goal is going to change throughout the weekend. All we ask is that you keep us in the loop about when those changes happen. So something that I like to do when I'm a delegate is if I'm ever confident that I'm changing my end goal at this moment, I'll write at the top of my paper, new end goal or revised end goal, and then write out my new end goal, underline the ways it's changed, highlight it maybe. Really, you're just wanting to make these notes as quickly and easily readable to your backroom staff as possible. And if we're in the loop, it's a lot less likely that we get confused. But if we're confused, we're not going to be able to respond well to your notes. There might be some excess time spent with us just trying to be on the same page about things. So keep us in the loop as much as possible. Don't hide you feel free to hide your arc from people in committee. Don't hide it from your backroom staff. We're here to support you and making sure your arc is as successful as possible. Okay, hopefully that was helpful. Again, we'll be monitoring the chat for questions. Amazing. See, another question. Do I have to explain what I am trying to achieve with each crisis note movement? A great question. I think the name of the game is being reasonable. So I think a reasonable amount of detail and explanation is going to be most successful. So if it's something that's sort of obvious or something that you think maybe the explanation is implied, or it's something that you think you've already justified before, you don't need to restate your explanation for every single moment of your crisis arc. But any times you think there's a possibility that your staffer is going to want a little more clarification about what you're doing, they're going to want some justification about why you're doing it. Do you have the resources you need to do this? Those are all times that you really should explain what the steps you are that you're taking. So you don't need to explain every single detail that goes in your crisis note, but I encourage you to, as much as reasonably possible, give us a good, solid explanation for all the steps that you take, all the actions that you do, especially any large, significant, challenging asks that you put into your notes. Give those a lot of explanation, not the stuff that seems more reasonable, is more accessible to your character. Okay, we'll keep monitoring the Q&A for questions. Oh, wonderful. I'm seeing some more questions in the chat. So the first question I see is, do our crisis notes have to be addressed to someone we have definitely associated with? Um, definitely not. So it would be pretty unreasonable for us to ask that everybody who your character would have access to in this committee, everyone who they have access to at this time. Uh, that will require a lot of research on your end, memorizing a ton of names. And also, I think it's more interesting if you have access to a larger cast of characters, can be a little bit more innovative with and adaptive with what you have access to. So I think within reason, you can assume that you have access to a lot of more characters than you would actually have access to in real life. And just give us a little justification as to why this is the case. So maybe you're writing to your brother, who you're going to say is in this role. Maybe you're going to write to your ex-lover who is in this role. Maybe you're going to write to your partner who is in this role. Maybe you're going to write to your uncle who is in this role. Maybe this is a friend from summer camp. Whatever the justification you want, just give us a little tidbit into how you know this character. That's going to help us make our responses to you more interesting and fun. But you can definitely be more adaptive in real life, certainly. You can take a lot of creative liberties with who you have access to. Pop stars, celebrities, military, government officials, whoever you need to get access to something. Within reason, I think you can assume that you have some relation to them. So you couldn't, for example, assume you have a relationship to the Queen of England. So that would be a bit unreasonable. But you could assume that you have other reasonable associations with characters who might be relevant to the committee or relevant internationally, et cetera, et cetera. Especially if your character isn't somebody as well known. There's sort of a trade-off when characters that are more well known in committee are going to sort of naturally come up more in debates. But on the flip side, characters who aren't as well known, you have a lot more chance to take creative liberties and can really push your arc in ways that is going to have super big impact on committee. Okay, that is the only question I see at this time. Again, I'm going to keep monitoring the chat for about 15 or so more minutes until the end of our office hours today. These have been great questions, guys. Feel free to keep thinking about them over the next 15 minutes and asking them if you have any. We have about 5 more minutes in our session today, so if we have any last questions, feel free to ask them in the chat before we head off. But again, if you have any more questions between now and the time of the conference, feel free to shoot us an email. Please give me some patience during the holiday season, but you should hopefully get a quick response. And then again, we'll be doing lots of training before the committee starts, during the committee, after the committee. So don't fear if you have any questions that you don't think have gotten answered sufficiently until we get there. If you just want to ask them in person, we have plenty of time to do that before we kick right into our substantive debate on the first committee day. Okay, any last questions, feel free to ask them in the next few minutes. Oh, perfect. I looks like we have one more question maybe before, unless we got a last minute one before we end our session here. I see the question, can we write our speeches beforehand? This is a great question. Um, you definitely can. I will say a few things on that note though. Number one, it's gonna be really hard to, it's gonna be, I wouldn't even say really hard, it's gonna be impossible to fully write all of your speeches beforehand for this committee. You're not gonna know what other people are doing in their crisis arcs. I don't know where committee's going to go. You certainly don't know where committee's going to go. So it would be impossible to write all the speeches that you could possibly need, which is why I'm going to go to point number two, which is that I encourage you to try not to pre-writing any speeches. While I won't strictly have an issue with people writing a speech beforehand, especially those like opening speeches. I think everybody spends a little bit of time thinking about what you're going to say in this sort of first speech. You're talking about your character, what your general goals are. But I want to encourage you as much as possible to try not to write your speeches beforehand, even if it's writing it during the committee session. There's no outside working committee, so definitely don't be writing speeches during the breaks. But I'm going to encourage you to try to give the speeches off the cuff without pre-writing it, any notes or any specific like the entire speech on a page. What I like to do is I just write a few bullet points, a few key words that I want to cover in this speech. So maybe I want to talk, I'm talking about this directive, so I'll write down the name of the directive and maybe 3 bullet points of things I want to cover about this directive. And that way, if I ever get lost or I stumble, I can look down quickly, see one of those 3 bullet points, go, oh, why don't I talk about bullet point two? Then I talk about bullet point two. I'm gonna encourage you to do that for one. I think it's just stronger public speaking involves not relying on notes, making eye contact with the people you're speaking to, projecting, keeping your voice up, not having your head out of paper. So I think from a purely logistical standpoint, makes you a better public speaker if you're not writing your speeches beforehand. But also, as I said, there's gonna be a lot of multitasking going on. You're writing directives, you're writing backroom notes. If you're also writing entire speeches, it's going to be impossible for you to balance all this work, and it's going to suffer the rest of your quality work in this committee. So while it's, I think, a really, really, really hard skill, it's also one that you can only get better at through practice. So I encourage you to try to give these speeches without writing anything beforehand, maybe just a few bullet points, just a few notes, and then jumping into that speech. I'm going to understand everybody gives bad speeches. I give bad speeches every weekend I compete, so that's totally okay. Don't let that fear stop you from giving speeches, even if you don't have anything wrote. I'd much rather see you always have your placard up in the air, even if not every speech is perfect, than see you give a speech maybe once a day and it's a perfect speech. Much, 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 much rather have you do the former than the latter and push yourself to give as many speeches as you can, even if they're not all 100% perfect and even if they're not prepared. Okay, it is 9:31 Eastern. I don't see any more questions in the chat. So it looks like that brings us towards the end of our 90-minute office hours. Had so much fun talking with you guys. Thank you so much for asking all these questions. They were really great. Again, I said it a million times and I'll say it once more. We will have lots, lots, lots of time at the beginning of the committee session for us to go through some more training, for us to talk about any more questions you have. So don't worry if you feel like something hasn't been fully resolved yet, or if you have any specific questions, or if any questions come up during the weekend. This is a time for us all to work together. There's going to be lots of people with no experience in crisis before, so we're going to start all of the basics. We'll have lots of opportunities for us to continue with this training. So again, no fear if you feel like something isn't fully 100% certain in your mind. We'll have time to go through questions. We'll do a round of correctives. We'll go through more questions. We'll keep going through questions throughout the weekend. So again, lovely to get to meet some of you. And I can't wait to meet the rest of you in Dubai in just a few short weeks. Awesome. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.